No, we're going to be talking, as I said, to Richard McIntyre from Federated Farmers Dairy Section. But we should also talk to him about this latest Radio New Zealand investigation called Crown versus Cow, the inside story of how we failed to regulate our worst climate polluter. So Radio New Zealand have decided that they hate dairy, all right? And their in-depth reporter, Kirsty Johnson, is apparently investigating how the cows beat the crown in global emissions. So, again, Radio New Zealand, based in Auckland and Wellington, long way from reality, wouldn't have a job. None of those people, none of them, not a civil servant at the Ministry of Environment, not a reporter working for Radio New Zealand, certainly not Kirsty Johnson, wouldn't have a job if it wasn't for the dairy industry in this country. The dairy industry in this country over the last 30 years has kept this country alive like no other sector. Occasionally, tourism will earn more in export earnings, but as we know through COVID, that's not been consistent. But dairy has been the primary export earner for New Zealand. The reason we even have an economy, the reason we have a second-class health system, because it would normally be third class, is because of the dairy industry. So when something goes wrong with the dairy industry, can I tell you, it is a big deal. Now, at a time when it looks like the dairy industry is in a bit of trouble because of the international price that people are prepared to pay for our milk powder and our milk products, Radio New Zealand's decided to run a series called Crown versus Cow, the inside story of how we failed to regulate our worst climate polluter. So they have labelled the dairy industry, this is Radio New Zealand, the mainstream media outlet that we own, that has labelled the dairy industry our worst climate polluter. In fact, this is the introduction to that particular series that they've just started running this morning, part one of it. Agriculture is warming, this is the introduction from Radio New Zealand. Agriculture is warming the earth faster than any other industry in Aotearoa. I'll repeat to you that. That's the introduction to this show by Radio New Zealand. Agriculture is warming the earth faster than any other industry in Aotearoa. Can I say, Kirsty Johnston, you're a moron. And so are the Radio New Zealand people who employ you and who have put this program together. If that's your opening introduction to your particular section paid for by the New Zealand taxpayer, you wouldn't have a job if it wasn't for the dairy industry. Now, they don't mind cleaning up their act if the act is proven not to be clean. But I'll tell you what, when they're told that they are responsible, the primary responsibility, the New Zealand dairy industry, take this people, the New Zealand dairy industry is the primary reason why the earth is warming and are the primary responsibility for climate change in the world, you know you've moved into some sort of psychosis. That's all I'll say. Which is a really good time to introduce our next guest, Federated Farmers, head of their dairy section, Richard McIntyre. Welcome to the show, Richard. Have you come across that Radio New Zealand documentary yet?
No, I haven't yet, actually. I've been in a Federated Farmers board meeting all morning, so I haven't come across it yet, but very good introduction.
Well, go and have a look. It's called Crown versus Cow, the inside story of how we failed to regulate our worst climate polluter. They've gone after the anti-vaxxers and the anti-mandators. Now they're coming after you. So does it start to piss you off after a while?
To an extent, we're a little bit used to being the whipping boys, I suppose, of the various sort of environmental groups and that sort of thing. And I don't know, they always come up with various sensationalistic sort of titles or statements in order to try and get their point across. But look, the first comment I'll make here is about emissions leakage. So New Zealand are the most efficient producers of milk and meat in the world from a greenhouse gas emission point of view. Right, so with global demand for meat and milk, as it is, or it actually continues to grow, if we reduce our output, countries that are less efficient than us due to their farming systems, etc., or climates, will produce more milk or meat in order to fill that gap, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so essentially, global warming emissions will go up, right?
Yeah.
So it's a ridiculous statement that they're making.
Well, according to Radio New Zealand, you are warming the earth faster than any other industry in Aotearoa. It's your fault.
Yes, I don't even know what to say there. It's ridiculous.
It is.
And they need to.
But listen, and the worst part is they're using our taxpayer dollars to promote this propaganda.
Yep, no, exactly. And look, the big point to make is, yes, we are producing emissions. Biogenic methane does have a greater warming effect, but it is short-lived. There's a methane cycle. And so the methane is constantly going into the atmosphere and being recycled out of it and going through cows again and being recycled. So as long as you're not increasing your methane or your methane output, you're actually not increasing global warming. Whereas fossil fuels or carbon released from fossil fuels, once they go into the atmosphere, they stay there for hundreds and thousands of years. To pull them out in terms of trees, you actually don't gain anything unless the trees have essentially gone down back into the earth, if that makes sense. So, it's a really complex a complex argument or complex question, I suppose. But it's one that Radio New Zealand clearly don't understand.
All right. Now the next bit, though, I wonder if they understand as well. I'm not sure I do. I'm not a dairy farmer. You are. Explain this to me. You've got Fonterra. They're the big one. So I mostly, if I'm a dairy farmer, sell my milk to them, but they're not the only. How much of the milk that's produced in New Zealand does Fonterra buy?
Well, the last time I saw the stats, it was around 80%, but it does vary between the North Island and South Island.
Does the North sell more or less?
So there's more in the South Island that is Fonterra milk.
Right. Okay.
So there are more other processors in the North Island.
Okay. So 4 out of 5 farmers basically, or 4 out of 5 dairy farming operations linked to Fonterra, roughly. So when the price that is paid out by Fonterra drops, that obviously has a massive effect upon the New Zealand economy. But I'm assuming also the 20% who don't sell to Fonterra are caught up in that as well, yeah?
That's correct. They do sell to similar markets. They often have different product mixes, but the global dairy trade influences the prices that most milk products are traded internationally through. The other point to make is Fonterra is a great big cooperative. A couple of the other processors are cooperatives, but the others are just businesses, and so they want to pay the least amount possible for their milk, and so they will pay as similar to the Fonterra milk price in order to get the production as possible, but they certainly won't pay over that. So essentially, all the milk sold in New Zealand is kind of linked to the Fonterra milk price, unless you're Tatua, which is a little bit different.
So why would I, if I was, and could you explain this to me as a layman too, why would I sell to somebody who wasn't Fonterra?
Look, I guess in the same way that some people prefer different brands of potato chips or a fizzy drink or whatever, everyone's sort of got different ideas of what they like and what they don't like, and not every farmer likes Fonterra's values and all that sort of thing, or would prefer for them to be doing something slightly different, and so they want a different company. In terms of why they would sell to an independent processor or supply an independent processor rather than Fonterra, part of it is shareholding. If you are a Fonterra supplier, you have shares in Fonterra, and there's a large capital requirement for that. Whereas if you supply an independent processor, you don't require shares at all. And so, obviously that's far easier to get over the line with your bank if you're not having to buy shares.
Right. So if I'm entering the market and I'm becoming a dairy farmer for the first time, I would spend less capital selling it to a non-Fonterra than if I had to join Fonterra.
Correct.
Right. I got it now. Okay. Thank you. And the other thing is, you've got these big factories everywhere. We see them dotted all over the country. Just again, explain to us non-dairy people and non-egg people, What are they doing primarily? Turning most of that milk into milk powder?
That's correct. So New Zealand's dairy farming system is largely seasonal. So they produce a large amount of milk that follows the grass growth curve. So a lot of grass is grown in the spring.
Yep.
A little bit less in the summer, a bit more in the autumn, and then very little in the winter. And so New Zealand's milk supply kind of follows that. So there's a huge amount of milk produced in the spring because everyone's calving their cows late winter. So a lot of milk's produced, and the most efficient thing for a processor to do is to convert that into whole milk powder during that peak supply. But there are a whole lot of other products that can also be produced with the rest of the milk. And so there's casein, cheese, butter, obviously, a whole lot of things like that, a whole lot of other ingredients and pharmaceuticals, etc. A lot of the processors have, significant sort of value add components. There are a whole lot of different product mixes. And so probably one of the things to note is that there's some capacity to shift product mixes based on pricing. So at the moment, whole milk powder is not worth a huge amount, but cheese has actually gone up in value. And so all the processors will be having their cheese plants running overtime and their whole milk powder plants going as slowly as possible.
Gotcha. And so the latest and you trade milk powder on an international auction scheme. How often does that happen? Once a month or something, is it?
So it's every 2 weeks, the global dairy trade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so prices are now dropping off quite significantly in the last month. And the last auction, I think, was yesterday or the day yesterday. Was that right?
Yeah, yesterday. Yeah.
And that confirmed the downward trend, almost 8% drop compared to this time last year.
8% less than 2 weeks ago.
Oh wow. Okay. So that's quite a significant drop. And the consequence of that is, and this is why I'm talking to you obviously, the consequences of that for New Zealand are what? So
obviously it's an indicator that the milk price may continue to go down. Fonterra revised their milk price down from $8 to $7. When was it? 2 or 3 weeks ago now.
Yeah.
So that revision in and of itself took $1.8 billion out of dairy for Fonterra suppliers' cash flows, and about $5 billion out of the economy.
Wow. Yeah. So right. And so that is obviously what we pay for health education. No wonder it's all so bad at the moment. That's not your fault, though. Can I ask, though, do you expect that to drop further from a midpoint of $7 per kilogram?
Look, hopefully not. I think Fonterra's been a little bit conservative with their revision. We've always said to them we want bad news early. If we have to have bad news, we want it early so we can plan around it. And so to get bad news now means that we can adjust our cash flows, have the discussions with the bank, not upgrade equipment, and maybe just try and maintain it rather than upgrading it, all that sort of stuff, so that we can sort of get through the season. Whereas if we had that information, later on in the season, once most of our spending's been done, then there's a far bigger hole to try and get through, and it's a lot more stressful in that respect.
Why are those prices dropping so significantly?
Well, there are a few things. Most of it comes down to Chinese demand, because they do import a huge amount of dairy products globally. So we've got the fact that they've got a bit of a surplus in liquid milk that's been produced in China, which is a luxury item. And as a result, that surplus liquid milk is being being made into whole milk powder. We've also got the fact that China built up its inventories of food in general, but in particular whole milk powder, during COVID, because they knew that there would be supply chain disruptions, port closures, all of that sort of stuff, and they wanted to make sure that they could essentially feed the people. So they have large inventories of whole milk powder at the moment, and obviously we're post-COVID now, and so they're beginning to run those inventories down, hence the lack of demand. Other thing as well, tariffs come off whole milk powder going into China in January. So if you were a Chinese business looking to buy whole milk powder, you could buy it right now and pay a tariff, or you could wait a couple of months, run down your inventories, and then buy it in January without a tariff. So I think we're seeing a little bit of that as well.
Right. You're not expecting these conditions to be maintained, though? There is some more optimism for the next season?
Yeah, look, the general feeling is that we're not going to see anything improve this year for the reasons that I've said. But heading into, I guess, next calendar year, but in particular next farming season, which is from June onwards, we should see a lift in dairy prices.
All right, so you're expecting this to be just one of those seasonal declines. It'll get a bit ropey. Well, $5 billion out of the economy, though. It's a massive effect for New Zealand.
Yeah, look, it certainly is. I really feel for all of the all of the rural communities. The rural supply stores, etc., and everyone that spends money or relies on money flowing through rural communities. They are going to struggle a little bit.
Do you think, Richard, there's going to be people going to the wall, or it's not that bad? They'll be able to hold on, and banks are sympathetic.
Look, I hope there aren't people going to the wall, but I feel that there will be. The big challenge that we've got is beyond this drop in milk price. We've seen 14 to 17% on-farm inflation over the last couple of years, so that's double what we've seen through the country in general. And we've also got really high interest rates. Just like everyone in town, I suppose, with their residential interest rates. And so we've got a lot of farmers who have recently bought farms over the last few years, a lot of first farm buyers who have a huge amount of debt, and the interest rates are really starting to cripple them at the moment, in addition to this drop in milk price.
Is that compensated for in any way by the appreciating land prices? So I've got this debt, it's billions. You're right, I'd be affected by any change in interest rates, particularly if it's going the other way. But is my land price, the asset that I own, appreciating to the same extent?
No, land prices have stayed relatively flat for the last few years. So unfortunately not. That would be a good news story if it was. But we're not seeing any gains in that respect, unfortunately.
And so if you do go to the wall, and when farmers do and have in the past, who tends to buy those dairies that go onto the market in those straitened circumstances? Are they corporates, or are they people just trying to get into the industry?
Well, obviously, it varies. Corporate ownership of farms has been increasing over the last wee while. So no doubt there'll be plenty of corporates buying them. It does depend on the scale of the farm a little bit as well. But look, it's increasingly hard to save up the money in order to have a deposit on a farm these days. Yeah. Especially the share milking models worked very well across a lot of years, and it still does work. But the cow to hectare, the cow value to hectare value ratio has changed a lot over the last probably 20 years, where you need a lot more cows, essentially. You need to own a lot more cows in order to buy a hectare of land than had to happen in the past. Which
is ironic, really, because here you have with Waka e Noa, is it the emissions scheme that was agreed between, I think, Fed Farmers and the government, or at least the agriculture sector and the government, is designed to keep a sort of a ceiling on cow numbers, isn't it?
No, it wasn't designed to keep a ceiling on cow numbers as such. It was designed to find a pathway to, reduce emissions in a cost-efficient manner, I suppose, to fund additional research. Because at the moment, farmers don't really have any genuine tools to reduce greenhouse gas emission beyond reducing reducing production, basically. Yeah. And as we know, we're the most carbon efficient producers of milk and meat in the world, and so it doesn't really make sense to do that, without and create that emissions leakage, as I said.
So where next for this one? Because what is the status currently of Waka e Noa?
Look, it's not my policy portfolio, so I better be a little bit careful, but it's still there, but I don't think it's doing a huge amount.
Yes, well, and that's the criticism, isn't it? I mean, that's why Radio New Zealand's running this, because the argument is that you had this agreement with Jacinda Ardern, this is the dairy sector and the agricultural sector in general, and then it's fallen apart. You'd have some views on why it fell apart?
My view on it would be that it fell apart due to, having a few too many people in the room, and it was very hard to reach agreement. But equally, there were a whole lot of really good options that got vetoed at the very start because MFE and MPI were in the room as well, saying, "Oh no, the minister won't agree to that. No, don't even think about that. Oh no, the minister won't agree to that. Don't even think about that." And then it went down and went through the process and got to this point where it was hardly recognisable when you compared it to the principles that founded it, if that makes sense in terms of the outcome. And MFE and MPI pulled out at the very end and said, it's not appropriate for us to be co-signatories to this. So they were there the whole time steering it in different directions, but then pulled out at the very end.
So that would be one of the reasons that you'd be looking for what's going to happen in 8 weeks' time with a great deal of interest.
Oh, look, certainly. Yes, it would be very interesting to see what the election outcome is. Ultimately, farmers want to do the right thing by the environment. They want to reduce emissions where they can and where they need to, but they need support to be able to do it, and they also need a process that will actually work. What's very clear is they need to feel that what they're doing isn't virtue signaling. What they're doing is actually going to make a difference to the climate and not and improve global warming rather than making it worse.
Yeah, the thing that's always struck me though is that New Zealand is only one of two countries, I think, is it China's the other one initially, that signed up for agriculture being in the Kyoto Protocols because it was designed to specifically exclude food production, yet we signed up for it. Is that still an option you've got to negotiate with the government in 8 weeks' time, should there be a change?
To be honest, I'm not 100% sure where we sit with regards to that. Certainly, it is a bone of contention, this idea of reducing food production in order to reduce emissions when there are other levers that could be pulled in that respect. I think the really important thing to remember here is that so many of the other signatories were highly industrialized countries where a heap of their emissions came from old factories burning coal, is the best way of explaining it. And so it was very easy for them to say, yes, we can reduce our emissions by essentially modernising a few factories, etc., burning a bit less coal, and everything's good. Whereas New Zealand is heavily agriculture centric, and so what we've signed up to, so for us it's a very different situation, I suppose, in order for us to honour those agreements. There's been this argument put forwards that this idea of not compromising food production only applied to undeveloped countries. Although, there's an argument that's definitely not the case as well. So it's an interesting one.
And hey, Waka Anoa, does it get resurrected if there's a change in government in its original form?
Look, it's I'm not far enough up the food chain to comment on that, Michael. Unfortunately, there are other people at play that will make that decision.
All right, okay. Richard, thank you very much for that background as well. I've learned an awful lot. I think a lot of people have as well who aren't dairy farmers. Thank you for joining us. The very best of luck to you. All right, that is Richard McIntyre, who's head of the dairy section at Federated Farmers. And the reason why we had him on the show is, as he pointed out, the dairy prices dropped from $8 a kilogram to $7 a kilogram. That's what Fonterra have indicated. He has indicated in the background some people may go to the wall. And he's also talked about the other costs, of course, that are on top of your dropping price that you're getting for your milk. Is 14% inflation. That's what he says production inflation is. And also high interest rates. And because so many dairy farms are debt geared, and a lot of debt geared, any fluctuation in interest rates is going to make a massive structure or change to them there. Interesting times.